Hello, dear friends. Welcome back to our next Chronicle of the Age of Chivalry. Edward the First, between the years 1272 and 1307. A little bit about him. He was, in his outlook and behaviour, quite unlike his father, Henry III. A strong leader, he was viewed with respect and fear throughout England, yet his devotion to his first queen, Eleanor of Castile, whom he married in 1254, was striking. He was renowned for dispensing good justice, and the great series of statutes he made, tackling a wide range of grievances, is a monument to his reign. His military skills were considerable and frequently exercised in the conquest of Wales, the subjugation of Scots, hence his nickname the Hammer of the Scots, and in wars to defend his duchy of Gascony against the King of France, Philip IV the Fair. The costliness of these offensives produced serious financial problems, but Edward weathered the storms. News of his death in 1307 was greeted with dismay. So, a transformative monarch, I suppose, on the story of England. And here we have some more about him. Edward, firstborn son of King Henry III, by Eleanor, daughter of the Count of Savoy, succeeded his father on the throne at the age of 34, so coming to it far more mature than his father ever did, of course. He was skillful in the conduct of affairs of state, and was from boyhood dedicated to the practice of arms, for which he won a worldwide reputation surpassing that of any other Christian prince of his time. Elegant in appearance, being a head taller than average in stature. In boyhood his hair was silvery blonde in colour. In his youth it began to turn fair to dark, while in old age it became a magnificent swan-like white. His forehead was broad, and the rest of his features were regular, except that his left eyelid drooped, which gave him a resemblance to his father. Despite a lisp, he was not lacking in eloquence when persuasive arguments were needed. His long arms were in proportion to his supple body. No man was ever endowed with greater muscular strength or wielding a sword. His breast swelled above his stomach, and the length of his legs ensured that he was never dislodged from his seat by the galloping and jumping of horses. It's quite a fan account, isn't it? A bit of a fan fiction we're reading here, very effusively praised. So we have the castle builder of Edward I. He's built a number of great castles in the newly conquered Principality of Wales. So we've got lots here. We've got the castles of Cardiff, Llandovery, Bullif, Llanbadarn, Fairley, Criccieth, Harlech, Bear, Dolwyddelyn, Dayan, Ruthin, Chirk, Holt, Hope, Harward and Flint, Rutland, Conway, Bangor, Beaumary, Carnarvon. Lots of castles to fortify. Of course, Scotland had a number of them there already, but you can see just the sheer amount of fortifications and castles set up at these key points here. A big old castle builder. When Edward took a break from military pursuits, he indulged in hunting birds and wild beasts, especially stags, which he used to charge on horseback. When he had one cornered, he would strike it down with his sword rather than use a hunting spear. He was famed as one who enjoyed the enduring protection of the Lord of Heaven. For example, as a boy, he was once in the middle of a game of chess with one of his knights in a vaulted room, when suddenly, for no apparent reason, he got up and walked away. Seconds later, a massive stone, which would have crushed completely anyone who happened to be underneath it, fell from the roof to the very spot where he had been sitting. He attributed his miraculous escape to the Blessed Virgin Mary of Walsingham, for whom he felt particular veneration afterwards. He had a proud spirit. He was reluctant to endure wrongs and quick to forget danger when he was seeking revenge, but he was easily placated by a display of humility. On one occasion, when he was hunting fowl along a river bank, one of of his courtiers on the other side of the river was not taking sufficient care of the falcon which had brought down a wild duck among the reeds. Edward rebuked him, and when the man seemed to be ignoring his words, he added threats, to which the other, seeing that there was neither bridge nor ford in the vicinity, replied, "Oh, I am safe enough at this river between us." Infuriated, the prince plunged on horseback into the river, whose depth he did not know, and his horse swam across to the opposite bank, which was hollowed out by the downward flow of the water. After emerging with some difficulty, Edward drew his sword and set off in pursuit of the courtier who had taken to flight. The man soon abandoned hope of escape, turned his horse around, and bearing his head, knelt humbly, giving himself up to Edward's mercy. Diverted by this action from his original intention, the prince sheathed his sword. Returning together in peace, they turned their attention to the falcon which had been abandoned in the quarrel. I have written this account of Edward's character in boyhood in order to give future generations some notion of the fine actions which were characteristic of his conduct. So yes, being set up to be a very classical English gentleman, it would seem. A bastion of honourability, chivalry and more. The king of the forest. Here we've got an image of hunting with falcons. So English monarchs from William the Conqueror were devotees of the hunt. So forests were areas of land that might or might not be wooded, but they were firmly subjected to the forest laws. In the vast tracts of England, including the whole of Essex and most of Northamptonshire, peasants and monks were given rights to clear the undergrowth for their own uses to help the chase, but to make sure that no further liberties were taken, a hierarchy of verderers maintained the grim forest law, and among its punishments were mutilation and flaying alive. The great nobles, like the king, possessed their own private forests or chases. The Earl of Gloucester had Cranbourne and Malvern, very nice. The Earl of Derby, Needwood, the Earl of Leicester, Leicester Forest. They all employed staff of verderers under the chief huntsman, who was often a knight, who preserved game and tended the pack of hounds that was considered an aristocratic necessity. You got 2 seasons for hunting deer, November to February and June to September. Summer's the better season for when the deer were fat, and the passion for hunting was extreme in some cases. Richard of Cornwall, Edward I's uncle, took 32 bucks during 9 days in July 1252 in the forest of Rockingham. By the 14th century, an increasingly literate aristocracy wished to be informed about hunting. The professionals responded. William Tweedie, Edward II's huntsman, produced a practical hunting manual called L'Art de la Venerie. Falconry is a more scientific enthusiasm thoroughly ennobled when the Book of St. Albans was published in the 14th century. It laid down a hierarchy of birds to match the hierarchy of society. An eagle, or more curiously a vulture, was fit only for an emperor. A falcon, probably a female peregrine, was for a prince. A tiercel, male peregrine, for a nobleman. A hunting parson was only allowed a sparrowhawk. Interesting. A hierarchy of birds based on rank. Got some more accounts here. 1274. At Lyon in May, Pope Gregory X opened a general council of the church to which the Greeks and the Tartars sent formal embassies, as well as promulgating a number of disciplinary measures. This council enacted the union of the Greek with the Roman Church. On his way to attend the council at Lyon, the venerable doctor Thomas Aquinas, a member of the Dominican order, died at the Cistercian abbey of Fossa Nuova. The scholars of his day had nicknamed him the Common Doctor because his writings were so clear and intelligible. Born in the kingdom of Sicily, a son of the Count of Aquino, Thomas became a Dominican friar despite the opposition of his family, who wished him to enter a monastery. He was sent to his order's house of study in Paris, where he attained the degree of Doctor of Theology. Thomas Aquinas wrote 4 volumes on the sentences and 3 of disputed questions, the first on truth, the second on the power of God, and the third on the virtues. He also compiled a great Summa Theologiae among his many other writings, all extremely useful to readers. Thomas Aquinas' holiness and exemplary life are attested by miracles which occurred not only after his death, but even during his lifetime. Here is a artist suggesting great height by depicting him with a long neck. Yes, I suppose if he did actually look like that, it would be rather strange, wouldn't it? So according to Nicholas Trevor, a contemporary chronicler, Edward I was very tall. His nickname was Longshanks, that enabled him to wield a sword with sinuous dexterity and ride the most spirited horse. Edward's changes of direction during the war between Henry III and his barons earned him a reputation for untrustworthiness, even before he came to the throne. He was indeed as capable of faithlessness as his grandfather, King John, but he was far more successful. One writer characterised him as a leopard, an animal associated with deviousness, changing spots, of course. However, the same man also attributed to Edward the pride and ferocity of a lion. A leopard. Edward was also prone to fits of typical Plantagenet anger. On one occasion he threw his daughter Elizabeth's coronet into the fire. A formidable man, he personified many of the characteristics expected of a king. Decisive in war, chivalrous and conventionally pious, he lavishly endowed an abbey at Vale Royale in Cheshire, but ceased to support it in 1290. His piety did not prevent him from dealing severely with the clergy and the Archbishop of Canterbury when they crossed him over taxation in the last decade of his reign. An outstanding figure in European as well as British affairs, his ultimate aim was to go on crusade a second time, but events prevented him from doing so, probably for the best. And as king, Edward banned the tournaments in which he had taken such a prominent part in his youth to ensure that his knight's attention did not wander from military campaigning. His interest in the chivalrous and action-packed legends of King Arthur and Camelot contrasted markedly with his father's attachment to St. Edward the Confessor and his miracles. Edward didn't create new peerages, wasn't particularly generous to those who served him, although leading administrators, like his notorious treasurer Walter Langton, made their fortunes out of their positions. Edward II put Langton on trial for corruption soon after his father's death. The king expected his administrations to be carried out in his bidding, even when his demands were totally unrealistic, as when he demanded 100,000 quarters, an enormous amount of grain to supply his army in Gascony. Moreover, he also supported his servants even when his subjects demanded redress against their oppressions. As a king he wasn't greatly loved, but he was respected and feared. Here we have more on Thomas Aquinas, who we can see over here. During the night on which he died, Thomas appeared in a dream to his cousin, the Count of Aquino, dressed in his Dominican habit. Thomas handed a sealed letter to the sleeping Count, who woke soon afterwards, and finding himself holding this letter, called to his attendant to bring a light. When the Count opened the letter, he found inscribed in golden characters surpassing any human calligraphy, "Today I am made a doctor in Jerusalem." Keeping the letter carefully, he sent messengers to inquire after Thomas's health, and learned that he had departed this life on the very night of his appearance to the Count. During this year, a terrible disease called murrain attacked the sheep flocks of England, which were wiped out everywhere by this disastrous pestilence. It raged for the next 25 years and spread to every village in the land. Oh dear, could you imagine a plague of livestock lasting for that long? How did they eat or provide wool? This plague, hitherto unknown in this country, was widely believed to have been taken hold when a wealthy merchant from somewhere in France had landed in Northumberland, bringing with him a diseased sheep from Spain, which infected the entire English sheep population, whose numbers were double those of the country's cattle. For the English, however, this was a year of rejoicing because of Edward's coronation. Here the Augustan chronicler Thomas Wicks gives a well-informed description of the coronation. On Thursday, the 2nd of August, Edward I, King of England, returned from France to await, at last, the day of his coronation, preparations for which required the greatest possible care as befits a royal occasion. On Saturday, the 18th of August, the new king entered London, which had been lavishly decorated. Not only the citizens of London, but all the nobles of the realm had come there to greet him, clerics and laymen together, all of whom had assembled in answer to the royal summons, partly because of their uniqueness of the spectacle, but more in order to render homage to their king, forming an innumerable throng from all parts of the kingdom. Neither the pen nor the human tongue can describe the decorations of the city and the finery of its citizens, which had been zealously and cleverly devised without the thought of the cost in order to glorify the king. not permitted to be present at the coronation as a result of the petty squabble over the carrying of his cross, which had embroiled the two archbishops for a long time and had cost a lot of energy. The king took up the crown and shone in glory before the peers of his realm, as present beside the citizens of London and of other towns and cities from all parts of the kingdom, who had vied with one another in bedecking themselves in a variety of rich clothes, was a large throng of earls, barons, and knights, similarly decked out. The city itself, which is deservedly called the capital of our realm, gleamed with silks and cloth woven with gold. I shall not mention the feast which both amazed and delighted the people gathered from all around, nor should I pass over in silence how the Queen, Eleanor of Castile, like the King, shone radiantly, glorious in her regal crown. Let's hear a bit about Thomas Aquinas, who, even by non-Christians, is widely regarded as being one of the Middle Ages' most brilliant thinkers. His great work, Summa Theologiae, is unfinished, but even so, consists of more than 2 million words. He was canonized 50 years after his death. This is a portrait in the Santa Maria Novella in Florence. Interesting that he's referred to as the dumb ox here. So St. Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval theologian and philosopher known as the Universal Teacher, was born near Naples in about 1225. A younger son of the Count of Aquino, and attended for high office in the church, Thomas was accordingly sent to the school of the famous Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino at the age of 5. In his teens he studied at the University of Naples, where he secretly joined the Dominican friars, the new intellectual order vowed to evangelical poverty. His aristocratic relations' outrage had him kidnapped and imprisoned in the family castle. For over a year they tried every means to make him renounce his vows, even smuggling a beautiful prostitute into his bedroom. Thomas immediately chased her out with a flaming brand, and then from then on he was blessed with permanent freedom from sexual temptation, although his earliest biographer records that he always shunned women as a man avoids snakes. Interesting. Thomas's family relented. In 1248 the young theologian went on to study under Albertus Magnus at Cologne, where he began a lifetime's work of reconciling the philosophy of the Greek thinker Aristotle to Christian theology. Massively built, slow-moving and amicably taciturn, he was nicknamed the Dumb Ox by his fellow students. When he did speak, his brilliance was so apparent that Albertus prophesied, "This dumb ox will fill the whole world with his bellowing." And in 1252 he began to teach theology at the University of Paris, then the intellectual powerhouse of Europe, and in 1256 was admitted as professor. This is what it's all about, eh? Confidence is quiet, intelligence is quiet. Only talk when you need to, and listen for the rest of the time. Good lessons from the dumb ox there. He left Paris in 1259 and spent the next decade working in Italy, where he completed Summa Contra Gentiles, a manual for missionaries sent to convert learned Jews and Muslims. Because the latter didn't accept the scriptures, he based his arguments on natural reason, to which all men are forced to assent. He also wrote several still popular hymns, including Pangalingua and Laudación, and appears to have invented the verse form, though not the dubious contents of the limerick. In 1267 he started his great Summa Theologiae, a textbook for beginners in theology. This stupendous work, which even in its unfinished state runs to over 2 million words and 60 volumes in the most recent edition, exemplifies Thomas's extraordinary industry. He habitually dictated to 3 or 4 secretaries and was said to be capable of composing Latin prose even in his sleep. The textbook, which deals comprehensively with theories about God, creation, the nature of existence, and the Christian sacraments, was still being written in 1273, when an increasingly abstracted Thomas had a mysterious vision while saying Mass. After that he refused to dictate another word, declaring, "I cannot, because all that I have written now seems like straw compared with that I have seen revealed to me." 3 months later he died. Thomas's works were first regarded as dangerously innovative, and even after his canonization in 1323, his reputation grew comparatively slowly. It was only in the 19th century that St. Thomas was recognized as the principal theologian of the Catholic Church, and even by non-Christians the most brilliant thinker of the Middle Ages. Let's hear some more chronicles, this time in the year 1277. So, in January, the King of England sent a large army to the Welsh marches in order to fortify those lands which Llewellyn, Prince of Wales, having abjured his loyalty to the king, had frequently devastated, and to compel the prince to abandon his usual unruly behaviour. This was achieved, and the royal army stayed on until the following May, stoutly defending the territory. At that time, the King of England wanted to encourage the army that had been sent to the Welsh marches as much as possible by being present in person. Accordingly, he assembled all the forces of his kingdom and set off for that region. On the 24th of June, he was in the Chester area, since between Chester and Llewellyn's territory there lies a forest so broad and dense that the king's forces were not able to pass through it without risk. A considerable area of the forest was cleared or cut down, leaving a broad way into Prince Llewellyn's land for the king and his men. Through this gap they entered in triumph the region that had been encroached upon in the raids. Edward I immediately began the construction of 2 castles, heavily fortified to suit the broad terrain on the banks of the River Clyde, which is daily washed by the tide. In order to provide secure quarters for himself and his men, one of the castles was called Flint, the other Rutland. The king stayed on in that area with his forces until the 11th of November, making frequent attacks on the Welsh lands. So constrained were the Welsh inhabitants that as their food supplies ran short, they were forced unwillingly to retreat to their last major stronghold, Snowdonia, with no further thoughts of resistance or rebellion. Here we have an image of, I don't know if you can quite make that out in the black and white, it's well disguised in the trees behind it in this black and white photo, but that's Conway Castle. The outer walls are almost a mile in circumference, enclosing a royal residence. It's lovely. Lots of beautiful castles in Wales, actually. They're the most impressive series of medieval fortifications in Britain. Its Welsh strongholds display the art of castle building at its highest point in development. Each is a masterpiece in its own right. Collectively, they represent a program of fortress construction unparalleled in scale since the days of Imperial Rome, and one that strained the resources of an entire nation. Their cost was immense, some £100,000 at a time, when an average labourer earned less than £2 a year. To raise them, Edward recruited a vast army of worksmen, masons and craftsmen from virtually every county in England. Their purpose was to ensure the permanent subjugation of the last and most obdurate outpost of Welsh independence, the mountainous Principality of Gwynedd. Edward I ringed the conquered territory with no less than 10 great new royal fortresses, backed up by 12 lesser strongholds. All but one of the major castles was accessible to shipping, so they could be supplied by sea in times of siege. Edward attached newly founded fortified towns to 5 of them, planted with English settlers, attracted by tax concessions and trading privileges. These formed a reservoir of supplies and loyal manpower, and also speeded the Anglicisation of Wales. The overseer of the project, the Savoyard architect, Master James of St. George, incorporated the latest developments in military engineering into his castles. Instead of relying, like earlier fortresses, on a single central strong point or keep, which could have become a death trap, the new castles had a high enclosure wall studded with massive projecting towers, and from these the defenders could sweep the approaches with archery fire and cover the intervening wall tops if these fell to an attacker. Each tower could hold out alone, and in many of the castles, including Rutland, Harlech and Beaumary, pairs of towers were linked to form powerful gatehouses. So what had become the weakest point of a fortress's entrance became its strongest feature. At Harlech and Beaumary, respectively, the most dramatically sited and most technically perfect of the castles, Master James raised one circuit of towered walls within another. The outer defences were lower than the inner ones, and commanded by their fire, concentric fortresses like these were virtually impregnable. Harlech later became the castle of lost causes, the last British stronghold of beleaguered Lancastrians and Cavaliers. The great castles of Conway and Carnarvon were built as royal residences, and Carnarvon in particular reflects this concept. Its polygonal towers and horizontally banded walls imitate the defences of Imperial Constantinople, while its eagle tower recalls legends of ancient Welsh heroes from whom Edward claimed spiritual descent. Edward brought his queen here to bear the son, the future Edward II, who would be proclaimed the first Prince of Wales at Carnarvon. Wales has been under English rule ever since, in great measure because of the effectiveness of Edward's castle building. It's interesting, isn't there, that just concept of anglicising an area, building up all of these castles, then giving people incentive to move there, and you're just forcing population in there. Oh, we've got some lovely photos here. So Rutland was the first. Queen Eleanor built a fish pond in the courtyard surrounded by seats for her ladies. The yard itself was laid with 6,000 turfs. Beautiful, by the sea. Here's Beaumaris, the last of the Welsh castles to be built. You can see how this wall would carry around. You've got towers here. You don't have any real traction to be... There's another wall there. Don't have any traction to really enter from this side. Harlech here stands as a fighting fortress some 200 feet above old sea level. Its walls and towers are in ruin, but almost at full height, so you get the impression of how imposing it would have looked. Lovely images there. Wonderful. So in 1278, Edward I heard that Prince Llewellyn intended to repudiate the allegiance he had recently pledged, and it was furthermore reported to him on credible authority that the prince had refused to attend the royal parliament that had been held in London 3 weeks after Easter. In order to ascertain whether Llewellyn had indeed broken the pact by which he had earlier been bound, and had matched his words with deeds, the king set off for the Welsh marches on the 1st of August, accompanied by a very small escort of knights. Prince Llewellyn, lest he might be accused of prevarication or of breaking the agreement, went to greet King Edward I as his lord when he reached the marches and paid him all due honour. Now that the pact between the king and prince had been renewed, the latter made a most advantageous marriage to Eleanor de Montfort, daughter of the late Earl of Leicester, Simon de Montfort, a match that the prince had been seeking for some time. Here is the head of Llewellyn, carved in stone, Prince of Wales until his death in battle in 1282. He was the country's last independent ruler, and after his death his title was given to the English sovereign's eldest son. Here's the execution of Llewellyn. Londoners jeered at his severed head when it was displayed at the Tower of London. A Welsh poet described his death as a cosmic disaster. Glory to God and the highest peace on earth to men of goodwill, a triumph to the English and to the Welsh, everlasting extermination. Wow, that's quite an opening gambit. These sentiments, expressed by an excited royal clerk when he learned of the death of Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, Prince of Wales in 1282, were echoed by other commentators who celebrated what they regarded as Edward I's subjugation of the Welsh. But the king himself had always been careful to count the Welsh among his subjects. He had regarded Llewellyn, even at the height of his power, as Prince of all Wales, as no more than one of the greatest among the other magnates of my kingdom. His first Welsh campaign in 1277 was mounted to bring this rebellious vassal to heel. The conflict was not the inevitable outcome of the personal antagonism between the two men. Disagreements over landholding and castle building had arisen between administrators before Edward's return from the Holy Land in 1274. But when Edward provided a refuge in England for the Welsh barons, including Llewellyn's own brother David, who had plotted against Llewellyn's life, the prince's attitude hardened. Edward in turn was disturbed by Llewellyn's decision to marry Eleanor de Montfort. He believed that the marriage would scatter the seeds which had grown from the malice which her father had sown. Edward was concerned by the more recent intrigues of Guy and Amaury, the sons of Simon de Montfort, who was still at liberty in Europe. The king arranged for Eleanor, who had married Llewellyn by proxy in France, and her brother Amaury to be captured at sea in 1275 on their way from France to Wales. Negotiations between prince and king were deadlocked when Edward insisted that Llewellyn should fulfill his feudal obligation and pay homage. Llewellyn maintained that he would only do so on specified conditions, such as the release of Eleanor, which were unacceptable to the king, and Llewellyn was formally condemned in Parliament as a rebel against the crown. By the summer of 1277, having been deserted by his vassals, Llewellyn surrendered to the might of Edward's army. The king seemed bent on disinheriting Llewellyn completely, but an agreement negotiated at Aberconwy allowed the prince to retain Snowdonia for his lifetime, provided he recognised the hereditary right of his younger brother David to a share of Snowdonia. While Llewellyn lived, David would hold a lordship in the land east of the Conwy. David was resentful that his earlier adherence to the king was not rewarded more generously, a resentment deepened by his friction with royal officers who administered the land which bordered upon his own. The War of 1282 was instigated by David rather than Llewellyn, who despite his grievances preferred more politic solutions, influenced by his wife. Llewellyn and Eleanor were formally married on a resplendent occasion in Worcester Cathedral on St. Edward's Day 1278, with Edward I's consent and at his expense. When David rose in a rebellion at Easter 1282, Eleanor was with child, and Llewellyn, who hoped for a male heir to his princely status and political aspirations, did not join him until June, when his wife died, giving birth to a daughter. So terrible, isn't it, the mortality rate of childbirth through the ages. His active participation in the Welsh movement brought it great strength. It was late autumn before Edward was in a position to attack Snowdonia. The conflict was further postponed when John Peckham, Archbishop of Canterbury, intervened. From his accession in 1279 he tried to bring the Welsh Church into line with the English, and his ill-considered criticisms of Llewellyn and his strident condemnations of the Welsh for their moral failings had caused considerable bad feeling. But he was courteously received by Llewellyn, and discussions were held over 3 days. In November 1282, Llewellyn invoked the Trojan origins of the Welsh people, to be countered by Peckham's denunciation of the moral degradation of those very forebears whom the Welsh held in such esteem. Further negotiation was impossible. Edward declared war on the Welsh. Llewellyn, hoping to revive Welsh resistance in the south, moved to Builth, where he died in combat on the 11th of December 1282. His severed head was taken to the king at Rutland and then displayed at the Tower of London. English chroniclers describe the derision with which it was greeted by the London crowd. The Welsh poet Gruffydd ab Ieuancoch composed a magnificent eulogy in which he described the tragedy as a cosmic disaster. Edward completed the conquest of Wales in 1283. David was captured in Snowdonia and convicted of treason, hung and drawn, his quarters dispatched to 4 English cities. Terrible way to go. The king consolidated his conquest with the castles that we've seen, and he was a statesman-like ruler, but the harshest aspects of his administration provoked a major rebellion in 1294-5. His Welsh enterprise cost him dearly and contributed to the financial and ultimately political difficulties he encountered in his later years. Within Wales he acted prudently, after 1294-5, cultivating influential men. Their allegiance was to be an asset to his son Edward, born at Carnarvon in 1284. And I think that would be a good place to leave Edward for now. And after his conquering of Wales, we'll come back to Law and Disorder, a fascinatingly titled section, and of course more chronicles in the life of Edward the Thirst. I look forward to having you join me, but until next time.